An injured female leopard, bleeding and desperate, dragged herself through the African wilderness for 3 days until she reached the doorstep of a war veteran's remote cabin. What she did next defied every law of nature and changed both their lives forever. This is the true story of an impossible bond that no one saw coming. The scorching Kenyan sun beat down mercilessly on the Masai Mara as another day broke across the endless savanna. In the distance, Mount Kilima cast its shadow over the golden grasslands, where acacia trees dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of the wild, the distant roar of lions, the chattering of vervet monkeys, and the ever-present buzz of insects that never seemed to rest. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Hidden among the tall elephant grass, a female leopard named Django by the local Maasai tribe lay motionless, her golden coat matted with dried blood. 3 days had passed since the brutal encounter that had left her fighting for her life. The territorial dispute with a younger, stronger leopard had ended with devastating injuries. Deep gashes across her left flank, a severely damaged front paw, and internal bleeding that made every breath a struggle. Django was no ordinary leopard. At 8 years old, she had earned her reputation as one of the most cunning hunters in the region. Her territory stretched across 12 square kilometers of prime hunting ground, where she had successfully raised 3 litters of cubs. The Maasai warriors respected her, calling her Dume Waanga, the Queen of the Sky, for her ability to climb the tallest trees and disappear into the canopy like a ghost. But now, as she lay dying in the grass, none of her legendary skills could save her. The infection from her wounds had begun to spread, and her body was slowly shutting down. Every attempt to stand sent waves of agony through her battered frame. She hadn't eaten in 4 days, and dehydration was making her vision blur and her thoughts scattered. The younger leopard who had attacked her had been trying to claim her territory for weeks. The final confrontation had been inevitable, but Django had underestimated her opponent's ferocity. What should have been a warning display had escalated into a vicious battle that lasted nearly 20 minutes. When it was over, the younger leopard had claimed victory and disappeared into the bush, leaving Django broken and bleeding. As the hours passed, Django's survival instincts began to override her pain. Something deep within her genetic memory, passed down through countless generations of leopards, told her that staying in one place meant certain death. Predators would smell her blood, or scavengers would find her weakened body. She had to move, even if movement seemed impossible. With tremendous effort, Django began to drag herself through the grass. Each movement was agony, but she pressed forward, following some inexplicable internal compass that seemed to guide her in a specific direction. She didn't know where she was going or why, only that she had to keep moving. Her damaged paw left a trail of blood drops in the red earth, marking her desperate journey across the savanna. For 3 days and 2 nights, Django continued her agonizing crawl across the landscape. She moved mostly during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, hiding in whatever shade she could find during the brutal midday heat. Several times she nearly gave up, her body refusing to respond to her will, but each time something drove her forward, an inexplicable sense that salvation lay ahead if she could just keep going. The landscape gradually began to change as she traveled. The wild grasslands gave way to more cultivated areas, where local farmers had carved out small plots of land. She passed abandoned cattle enclosures and dried-up waterholes, always moving in the same direction as if following an invisible thread that pulled her forward. On the 3rd day, as the sun reached its peak and the heat became unbearable, Django's journey brought her to the edge of a small clearing. Through her fading vision, she could make out a structure that seemed alien in this wild landscape. A modest wooden cabin with a corrugated metal roof, surrounded by a small vegetable garden and a hand-built fence. The cabin belonged to no local farmer or safari guide. It was the home of someone who had come to this remote corner of Kenya, seeking the same thing Django was now seeking, a place to heal from wounds that ran deeper than flesh. The structure was simple but well-maintained, with solar panels glinting on the roof and a small generator humming quietly in the shade of a nearby tree. As Django approached the cabin, her strength finally began to fail completely. The infection had spread through her system, and her body temperature was dropping dangerously low despite the heat. Her breathing became shallow and labored, and her vision narrowed to a tunnel of fading light. Every instinct told her this was where her journey would end, but something about this place felt different, safer somehow. With her last reserves of energy, Django dragged herself up the 3 wooden steps to the cabin's front porch. The rough planks were warm from the sun, and for the first time in days, she felt a small measure of comfort. She positioned herself directly in front of the heavy wooden door, her body blocking the entrance completely. Then, summoning strength she didn't know she still possessed, Django did something that would defy everything anyone thought they knew about wild leopards and their relationship with humans. She lifted her massive paw and began to scratch deliberately at the door. The scratching sound against the wooden door was unlike anything Thomas Reeves had heard in his 3 years of solitude in the Kenyan wilderness. Sharp, deliberate, and persistent, not the random scraping of wind-blown debris or the playful antics of vervet monkeys that occasionally visited his porch. This was something purposeful, something alive, and something that shouldn't be there. Thomas had been deep in his morning routine, sitting at his small wooden table with a cup of black coffee, reviewing the weather data he collected daily for the Kenyan Meteorological Department. The remote job suited him perfectly. It required minimal human contact and allowed him to live in complete isolation, exactly as he preferred. At 52 years old, the former U.S. Army medic had spent the last decade avoiding anything that resembled his previous life. The scratching came again, more insistent this time, followed by what sounded like a low, rumbling vocalization that made the hair on his arms stand up. Thomas froze, his weathered hands gripping the coffee mug as his mind immediately shifted into the hypervigilant state that had kept him alive through 3 deployments in Afghanistan. His blue eyes, still sharp despite years of self-imposed exile, scanned the single room of his cabin for potential weapons or escape routes. Living alone in the Masai Mara meant constant awareness of dangerous wildlife. Thomas had encountered elephants, buffalo, lions, and various other predators during his time here, but they had always maintained their natural fear of humans. Wild animals didn't approach human dwellings, and they certainly didn't announce their presence by scratching at doors. This behavior was completely outside the normal patterns he had observed and cataloged during his years of solitary existence. The sound came a 3rd time, accompanied by what was unmistakably a weak, pained vocalization. Thomas recognized the tone immediately. It was the same sound wounded soldiers made when they were trying to communicate but lacked the strength for words. His medical training, dormant but never forgotten, suddenly surged to the surface despite his best efforts to suppress it. Against every survival instinct screaming at him to stay inside, Thomas slowly approached the door. His movements were careful and deliberate, a combination of military caution and the hypervigilance that had become his constant companion since leaving the service. He pressed his ear against the heavy wood, listening intently for any additional sounds that might help him identify what was waiting outside. The scratching had stopped, but he could hear something else now. Labored breathing, shallow and irregular. It was the kind of breathing pattern he had learned to recognize in triage situations, the sound of a body struggling to maintain basic functions. Whatever was outside his door was in serious distress, possibly dying. Thomas reached for the loaded rifle he kept mounted above the door frame, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the tremor that had never quite left them since his discharge. The weight of the weapon was familiar and comforting, even though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. He had come to Kenya partly to escape violence, but the wilderness had its own rules, and those rules often required deadly force for survival. Slowly, quietly, he moved to the small window beside the door and carefully lifted one corner of the heavy canvas curtain he had installed for privacy. What he saw through the gap made him question his own sanity and sobriety, despite being completely sober for the past 18 months. A massive female leopard lay sprawled across his porch, her golden coat streaked with dried blood and dirt. She was positioned directly in front of his door, her powerful body creating an imposing barrier to anyone trying to enter or exit. But what shocked Thomas most wasn't her presence, it was her behavior. The leopard wasn't acting like a wild predator. She wasn't pacing, snarling, or displaying any of the aggressive postures he would expect from a cornered or wounded big cat. Instead, she lay on her side, her breathing labored but controlled, her yellow eyes fixed directly on the door as if she was waiting for something. Or someone. Thomas had seen enough wounded animals during his time in Kenya to recognize the signs of severe trauma. The leopard's left flank showed deep gashes that had partially healed, but were clearly infected. Her front left paw was swollen and held at an unnatural angle, suggesting broken bones or severe soft tissue damage. Most alarming was the way she favored her left side, indicating possible internal injuries that could be life-threatening. His medical training warred with common sense as he studied the scene. Every rational part of his mind told him to stay inside, wait for the animal to leave or die, and then deal with the aftermath. Leopards were apex predators, capable of killing a human with ease even when healthy. A wounded leopard was potentially even more dangerous, driven by pain and desperation. But something about this situation felt fundamentally different from anything he had encountered in his years of wilderness living. The leopard's behavior was completely contrary to everything he knew about big cat psychology. Wounded predators typically sought dark, hidden places to recover or die. They didn't drag themselves to human dwellings and announce their presence. As Thomas watched, the leopard lifted her massive head with obvious effort and looked directly at the window where he was hidden. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met through the small gap in the curtain. In those yellow depths, Thomas saw something that made his breath catch in his throat: intelligence, desperation, and what he could only describe as a plea for help. The leopard held his gaze for several long seconds, then deliberately lowered her head back to the wooden planks and closed her eyes. The message was unmistakable. She had come here seeking help, and she was placing her life in his hands. Thomas stepped back from the window, his heart pounding against his ribs with a rhythm he hadn't felt since his last firefight in Kandahar. The rifle in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. The choice between action and avoidance, between engagement and the safe isolation he had carefully constructed around himself. He set the weapon down against the wall and ran his calloused hands through his graying hair, a nervous habit that had developed during his recovery from PTSD. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to radio for help from the Kenya Wildlife Service. Let the professionals handle this situation. Stay inside, wait it out, maintain the boundaries he had established to protect his fragile mental equilibrium. But the sound of that labored breathing through the door kept echoing in his mind, triggering memories he had spent years trying to suppress. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez bleeding out in a Humvee outside Bagram, begging him not to let her die alone. Private Jackson calling for his mother as Thomas worked desperately to stop arterial bleeding from an IED explosion. Dozens of young faces looking at him with trust and hope, believing that his medical training could somehow cheat death one more time. Thomas moved to his radio equipment, intending to call for wildlife authorities, but stopped with his hand on the transmitter. The nearest KWS station was 4 hours away by vehicle, assuming they could even locate his remote cabin. The leopard's breathing pattern suggested she didn't have 4 hours. She might not have 4 minutes. He began pacing the small confines of his cabin, his military boots creating a rhythmic pattern on the worn wooden floor. 3 steps to the window, turn. 5 steps to the back wall, turn, repeat. It was the same pacing pattern he had developed during his months of therapy at Walter Reed, when the walls of the psychiatric ward had felt like they were closing in around him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had come to Kenya specifically to avoid situations like this, moments where life and death decisions rested in his hands. After losing too many soldiers despite his best efforts, Thomas had sworn he would never again be responsible for another living being's survival. The weight of those failures had nearly destroyed him, driving him to the edge of suicide before he finally found the strength to walk away from everything he had once believed defined him. Yet here he was, faced with another dying creature that had somehow found its way to his door. The universe seemed determined to test his resolve, to drag him back into the role he had spent 3 years trying to forget. Combat medic, lifesaver, the person everyone turned to when death came calling. Thomas grabbed his field medical kit from the shelf above his bed, the same kit he had carried through Afghanistan but had never opened since arriving in Kenya. His hands shook as he unzipped the worn canvas bag, revealing supplies that were probably expired, but still functional. Gauze, antiseptic, morphine, sutures, and various antibiotics he had liberated from military stores before his discharge. The familiar smell of iodine and sterile packaging transported him instantly back to forward operating bases and makeshift aid stations. For a moment he was 28 years old again, confident in his abilities, trusted by his unit, believing he could save anyone if he just worked fast enough and smart enough. Before the failures started piling up, before he learned that sometimes, despite your best efforts, people still died in your hands. He approached the door again, listening carefully to the sounds from outside. The leopard's breathing had become more irregular, with longer pauses between each breath. He recognized the pattern: respiratory distress, indicating systemic shock, probably from blood loss and infection. Without intervention, she would likely die within the hour. Thomas unlocked the heavy wooden door, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stood there with his hand on the handle, fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with the potential danger from the leopard and everything to do with the demons he carried inside his own mind. Opening that door meant accepting responsibility again. It meant risking failure, risking the crushing weight of watching another life slip away despite his efforts. The scratching sound came again, weaker this time, barely audible through the thick wood. It was a sound of desperation, of a creature using its last reserves of strength to ask for help. Thomas recognized that sound too. He had heard it from dying soldiers who couldn't speak but could still tap weakly against his hand, trying to communicate their terror and pain. "I can't do this," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the silence of the cabin. "I can't go through this again." But even as he spoke the words, his hand was turning the handle. Some part of him, buried beneath layers of trauma and self-protection, couldn't ignore a call for help. It was the same part that had driven him to become a medic in the first place, the fundamental belief that preserving life was worth any personal cost. The door opened slowly, revealing the full extent of the leopard's injuries in harsh daylight. She was even larger than he had realized, probably weighing close to 120 pounds, with muscles that spoke of incredible power even in her weakened state. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, those same yellow eyes that had looked at him through the window, now filled with a trust that seemed completely impossible given the circumstances. Thomas knelt down beside her, his medical training overriding his fear as he began his initial assessment. The leopard didn't move away or show any signs of aggression. Instead, she seemed to relax slightly, as if his presence brought some measure of comfort or relief. "What the hell are you doing to me?" Thomas murmured, more to himself than to the dying animal before him. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As Thomas knelt beside the massive leopard, his hands automatically began the systematic examination that had been drilled into him through years of military medical training. But what he discovered, as he gently probed her injuries, sent shockwaves through his already fragmented psyche, dragging up memories he had buried so deep he thought they would never surface again. The primary wound along her left flank wasn't just a simple laceration from territorial fighting. The pattern of damage, the depth and angle of the cuts, told a different story entirely. Thomas had seen these exact injury patterns before, in a place thousands of miles away from the African savanna. His hands trembled as recognition dawned, and suddenly he was no longer kneeling on his porch in Kenya, but crouched in the rubble of a bombed-out building in Helmand Province. The leopard's injuries mirrored almost exactly those of Lance Corporal David Chen, a 19-year-old communications specialist who had been caught in an improvised explosive device blast during Thomas's second deployment. The shrapnel pattern, the way the fragments had torn through muscle and tissue, even the location of the secondary wounds. It was as if fate had placed an impossible mirror before him, forcing him to confront the case that had haunted him for over a decade. David Chen had been the first soldier Thomas had been unable to save. Not the last, but the first, and therefore the one who had cracked the foundation of his confidence as a medic. The treatable if he had recognized it sooner. More disturbing still was the leopard's behavior during the examination. She didn't resist when Thomas palpated sensitive areas, didn't growl or show defensive aggression when he cleaned her wounds with antiseptic. Instead, she seemed to understand that he was trying to help her, responding to his gentle touch with small movements that indicated cooperation rather than submission born of weakness. Thomas had to stop several times during the assessment, overwhelmed by flashbacks that made his vision blur and his breathing become irregular. The smell of IOD in young Marine had survived the initial blast, conscious and talking, even joking about wanting to get home to see his girlfriend graduate from nursing school. Thomas had stabilized him, stopped the bleeding, administered morphine for pain management, and radioed for helicopter evacuation. But complications had set in during the 40-minute wait for the medevac chopper. Internal bleeding that Thomas hadn't detected, damage to organs he couldn't assess with field equipment, infections that developed with terrifying speed in the harsh Afghan environment. David had died in Thomas's arms, just as the helicopter touched down. His last words, a whispered request for Thomas to tell his girlfriend that he loved her. The similarity between David's injuries and the leopard's wounds was so precise it felt like a cosmic joke, as if the universe was testing whether Thomas had learned anything from his years of self-imposed exile. The same torn muscle fibers, the same pattern of infection spreading from untreated lacerations, the same labored breathing that indicated possible internal damage. Thomas's hands began to shake more violently as he continued his examination, muscle memory guiding his movements while his mind reeled from the implications. The leopard's front paw showed signs of multiple fractures, probably from landing hard on rocky ground during her ordeal. Her temperature was elevated, indicating systemic infection, and her gums were pale, suggesting significant blood loss or dehydration. But it was the leopard's response to his touch that truly shattered Thomas's composure. Just like David Chen, she remained calm and trusting, despite her obvious pain, occasionally lifting her massive head to look at him with eyes that held no fear, only hope. That same expression of absolute faith in his abilities, the same trust that had made David's death so devastating to Thomas's sense of professional competence. The medical assessment revealed additional parallels that made Thomas question his own sanity. The leopard's heart rate was irregular, a condition Thomas had learned to recognize as a sign of traumatic stress affecting the cardiovascular system. David Chen had developed the same arrhythmia in his final hours, a condition that Thomas now realized might have been triggered memories of field hospitals. The feel of damaged tissue under his fingers brought back the weight of David's body going limp in his arms. The sound of labored breathing echoed with the voices of too many young soldiers he had failed to save. The leopard seemed to sense his distress, turning her great head to watch him during these moments of psychological crisis. There was something almost human in her gaze, an intelligence that recognized his internal struggle and offered silent encouragement. It was the same look David Chen had given him when the young Marine had realized he was dying. Not accusatory or angry, but somehow understanding and forgiving. As Thomas worked to clean and dress the leopard's wounds, using techniques he hadn't employed since Afghanistan, he began to realize that this encounter was no coincidence. The leopard had traveled for days, following some inexplicable instinct that had led her directly to the one person in this remote region who possessed the specific medical knowledge needed to save her life. But saving her would require Thomas to fully embrace the role he had spent 3 years rejecting. It would mean accepting responsibility for another life, risking the devastating failure that had driven him to exile. The leopard's injuries were severe enough that despite his best efforts, she might still die, adding another weight to the burden of guilt he already carried. Yet as he looked into those trusting yellow eyes, Thomas realized he had already made his choice the moment he opened the door. The leopard had chosen him, just as David Chen and dozens of other soldiers had trusted him with their lives. The question now wasn't whether he would help her, but whether he could find the strength to forgive himself if he failed again. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the doorway of the newly established Mara Veterans Wildlife Sanctuary, watching as Django moved gracefully through the rehabilitation enclosure he had built with his own hands. Her injuries had healed completely, leaving only faint scars hidden beneath her magnificent coat. But more importantly, Thomas had healed too. The leopard who had dragged herself to his door seeking salvation had unknowingly become his own path to redemption. Through the long nights of nursing her back to health, Thomas had rediscovered the healer he had always been beneath the trauma. Every small victory in Django's recovery had slowly rebuilt his shattered confidence. Word of the miraculous rescue had spread throughout Kenya's conservation community. Soon, other wounded animals began arriving at Thomas's door. An orphaned elephant calf, an injured lion with an infected paw, countless smaller creatures that somehow knew they would find sanctuary with the American veteran who understood pain and healing. The sanctuary had grown into something Thomas never imagined possible. Veterans from around the world now came to volunteer, finding their own healing through caring for wounded wildlife. The parallels were undeniable: broken warriors helping broken animals, each finding redemption in service to something greater than their own pain. Django had chosen to stay even after her full recovery, becoming the sanctuary's unofficial guardian and Thomas's constant companion. She had never shown any desire to return to the wild, as if she understood that her true purpose lay in helping other damaged souls find their way back to wholeness. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sit on his porch with Django beside him, watching the African sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In those moments, he often thought about David Chen and wondered if the young Marine would approve of how his memory had been honored, not through guilt and self-destruction, but through countless lives saved and souls healed. The leopard who had scratched at his door that desperate morning had brought him the most unexpected gift of all: the chance to transform his greatest failure into his most meaningful success. What do you think about this incredible story of healing and second chances? Have you ever experienced a moment when helping someone else ended up saving you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If stories like this inspire you to believe in the power of unexpected connections and second chances, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We share amazing true stories every week that will restore your faith in the beautiful, mysterious ways life brings healing to those who need it most. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.